It was a cold October night in rural Vermont, one of the most isolated and desolate regions of the United States. Emily Harrington, a 28-year-old woman, was returning to her hometown after years away. With her mother's recent passing, she had inherited the old family home, a century-old mansion perched on a hill, surrounded by dense forests and a dark, still lake. Since childhood, Emily had always heard stories about the house, a legacy left by her grandparents, filled with secrets and tragedies that had marked the Harrington family for generations. The place had been the site of strange and inexplicable occurrences, but Emily's mother always denied anything supernatural. She refused to talk about the past, about the strange noises from the forest, or the shadows that sometimes seemed to move on their own through the mansion's corridors. Now Emily was alone. When she opened the door for the first time in years, the air filled with the smell of mildew and neglect. The darkness of the house felt alive, as if it had been waiting for her. Emily turned on a flashlight and began exploring the rooms, feeling a strange presence, as if something was watching her. The windows creaked with the wind, and the sound of the trees swaying outside created an unsettling symphony. As she made her way down to the basement to check the house's breaker, Emily found a locked door she had never seen before. The key to that door hung from a necklace her mother always wore, now resting around her neck. She hesitated, but driven by a dark curiosity, she turned the key in the lock. When the door finally opened, a cold wind engulfed her, and Emily felt as though she had just awakened something that had been asleep for a long time. Inside was an old, forgotten room, with furniture covered in dust, and at its center a mirror. A tall mirror with hand-carved frames and glass tarnished by time. Emily felt a wave of dread as she looked at her reflection. Not because of her own face, but because there was something behind her. A shadow, almost imperceptible in the glass, was watching her. When she turned around, the room was empty, but the feeling that something had been unleashed did not fade. In the nights that followed, the house seemed to take on a life of its own. Footsteps echoed in the hallways when Emily was alone. Doors slammed for no reason, and the mirror, it seemed to call to her as if it wanted her to look again. But what disturbed her most were the nightmares. Dreams where she was dragged into the mirror by invisible hands, forced to face what was on the other side. A distorted version of her own reality, where the house was in complete ruins and a dark figure was chasing her. The days in the mansion became increasingly suffocating. Emily began to doubt her sanity, thinking maybe she was imagining it all. But the feeling of being watched was constant, and the longer she stayed there, the stronger the presence from the other side of the mirror became. What Emily didn't know was that the house held an ancient secret, a pact made generations ago to guarantee the Harrington family's fortune and prosperity, a pact sealed with blood and kept for centuries, until the moment she opened the wrong door. In the days that followed opening the door, Emily realized the situation was spiraling out of control. She spent sleepless nights, hearing disturbing noises from every corner of the mansion. Distant whispers, muffled laughter, and the constant sound of something scratching the walls. Every time she tried to convince herself it was just the wind, something more sinister happened. The morning after the worst of her nightmares, Emily decided to investigate the house's past. Something inside her told her that the key to solving this mystery was buried deep in the roots of the Harrington family itself. She drove to the Old Town Archive, a dusty building almost as old as the mansion itself. There, she found documents dating back to the 19th century, detailing the history of her ancestors, the first Harringtons to settle in that region. What she discovered was terrifying. Her great-grandfather, Ezekiel Harrington, was known in town for his obsession with the occult. He had been part of a local cult whose practices included forbidden rituals. One of the darkest rituals involved the mirror in the locked room of the mansion. The mirror, according to records, was an ancient artifact brought back from a trip to Europe. It was used as a door to what they called the other side, a world where restless souls and supernatural entities resided. It was believed that the mirror had the power to grant fortune to the Harrington family, but at a steep price. Future generations would be condemned to deal with the forces residing on the other side. Emily was horrified to realize that by opening that door and releasing the mirror, she had awakened an ancient force, an entity that had long awaited its chance to escape. The price her ancestors paid for wealth and prosperity was now hers to bear. When she returned to the mansion, she felt watched again. But this time the feeling was more intense, more direct. It was as if the entire house was alive, waiting for something or someone. That night, she had the worst nightmare yet. In the dream, she was inside the mirror, trapped on the other side. A version of herself, pale and deformed, watched her normal life from the other side of the glass, while Emily screamed in despair, unable to escape the dark place. She woke up drenched in sweat, but soon realized that the terror from the dream had become reality. The mirror at the end of the hallway glowed in the darkness. Something was moving inside it. That's when the presence fully manifested. The mirror no longer reflected her image as it once did. Now it showed a dark, twisting corridor where a hooded figure slowly approached. Emily felt an invisible force taking control of her body, pulling her toward the mirror, as if something wanted to drag her inside. Desperate, she called the only close friend left in her life, Tom, an old childhood friend who had stayed in town. Tom was skeptical about the supernatural, but when he heard the panic in Emily's voice, he decided to visit her that same night. When he arrived at the mansion, he found Emily agitated, her eyes red from lack of sleep, and the house in an even worse state than when she had first arrived. Tom tried to convince her that everything was just stress from her mother's death and the isolation in the mansion. He suggested it might be time to sell the place, leave the memories behind, and move on. But Emily knew it wasn't that simple. Something real and dangerous was lurking, and it was getting stronger. That same night, as they talked in the living room, they heard a loud bang from the basement. It was the same locked door, now open again. Tom, still skeptical, went down to investigate, leaving Emily alone for a few minutes. When he didn't return, Emily followed, her heart racing. The basement was completely dark, except for a faint light emanating from the mirror. Emily called for Tom, but the only response was the sound of soft footsteps, as if someone was walking behind her. The mirror, once inert, now clearly showed Tom's reflection, standing in the middle of the room, looking at her. But when Emily turned around, he wasn't there. The entity was toying with her. Desperate, Emily tried to break the mirror, but its surface was impenetrable, as if it were made of something far stronger than glass. The hooded figure continued to approach in the reflection, and with each step, Emily felt the air grow heavier, as if the space around her was collapsing. And then the voice whispered, "You have freed what should never have been freed." Emily fell to her knees, unable to escape the presence now filling every corner of the house. Tom remained trapped in the mirror, his expression of horror etched in place as the hooded figure approached him. She knew she had done something terrible, but it was too late to escape. That night, terror manifested in ways Emily could never have imagined. After Tom's disappearance, The house was enveloped in complete silence, but not the kind that brings peace. Rather, it was a heavy emptiness, as if the air was thick with something lurking, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Emily knew she needed to leave, but something kept her bound to the mansion. She felt that if she departed without confronting what had been awakened, she would never truly be free. So, she decided she had to face the entity in the mirror. Time seemed to stand still. Minutes dragged on like hours as she wandered through the mansion, searching for answers. With each dark corridor she entered, the feeling of being watched intensified. The shadows, once fleeting and distant, now took on more defined shapes, like figures moving in the gloom, always out of reach but never far enough to ignore. When Emily returned to the basement, the mirror awaited her, more sinister than ever. Now, instead of merely reflecting the room, it displayed something entirely different, a distorted and decrepit version of the mansion itself. The reflection revealed a house in ruins, with cracked walls covered in cobwebs, as if she were gazing at the future of a place long abandoned. In the center of this vision stood the hooded figure, watching her motionless, its eyes burning with an incandescent red light. Suddenly, the mirror began to vibrate. The glass, once solid, started to ripple, as if it were liquid. Emily recoiled, her heart racing, but before she could react, a skeletal hand emerged from the surface of the mirror. There was no escape. The being that had once inhabited her nightmares was now breaking free. When that thing finally emerged from the mirror, Emily screamed. It was a humanoid creature with pale, dry flesh stretched over long bones. Its face was obscured by the hood, but the stench of death that emanated from it was suffocating. The air in the room grew dense, and the temperature plummeted. Emily felt the cold seep into her skin, penetrating her bones. The entity did not speak. It did not need to. Its presence was oppressive, a manifestation of pure evil, ancient and filled with hatred. Emily knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that this was not just a ghost. It was something much worse, an entity that had been fed by the secrets and sins of the Harrington family for centuries, patiently waiting to finally escape its prison in the mirror. At that moment, a great turning point occurred. As Emily was overtaken by fear, her body frozen by the creature's presence, something began to awaken within her. A spark of understanding coursed through her. She recalled a detail she had read in the town archives. Her great-grandfather's rituals involved a final sacrifice to seal the pact. Only the blood of a Harrington could contain the entity. Reality hit her like a cold wave. If she wanted to stop the entity, she would have to offer something in return. The weight of this revelation was crushing, but Emily knew she had no other choice. Either she faced it now, or the entity would be completely unleashed, spreading its malice wherever it went. She ran to her mother's old study upstairs. There, locked in a drawer, was her mother's diary, which Emily had never had the courage to open. With trembling hands, she leafed through the yellowed pages until she found what she was looking for. There were instructions for a containment ritual, something her mother seemingly knew but never had the courage to perform. The ritual required a sacrifice, not of life, but of something equally powerful: sanity. To seal the mirror and trap the entity back on the other side, Emily would have to confront the mirror directly, allowing it to take a part of her mind, leaving her forever fragmented. With tears in her eyes, she knew what she had to do. She descended to the basement again, where the entity awaited her, still motionless, as if it knew the decision had already been made. Emily approached the mirror, and when her fingers touched the cold, shimmering surface, A wave of pain coursed through her mind. Her vision began to distort, and she could feel her own consciousness being drawn into the mirror. It was as if she were losing pieces of herself. Memories, feelings, everything collapsing into an endless spiral. But she pressed on. The entity let out a deafening scream, a sound that seemed to emanate from the depths of the earth, reverberating throughout the mansion. The mirror began to crack, and Emily felt as if her soul were being shattered along with it. The cracks spread across the surface, and the hooded figure vanished in an explosion of light, sucked back into the other side. When it was over, Emily fell to her knees, exhausted. The mirror lay in pieces, and the house was strangely silent again. The entity had been contained, but the cost was evident. Emily, though physically intact, was no longer the same. That sacrifice had taken parts of her mind, and now a darkness resided within her. She rose unsteadily, realizing that while she had saved the world from the entity, something inside her was permanently broken. The mansion still seemed alive, but now silent, dormant, as if waiting for the next Harrington descendant. Emily looked at the fragments of the mirror scattered across the floor. She knew she had won, but the cost would be tragic. Emily woke up on the cold basement floor, feeling the damp chill seep into her bones. Her muscles were stiff, and her mind was a blur. She tried to organize her thoughts, but something no longer fit. Fragments of memory, pieces of her own identity, seemed to be missing, as if they had been ripped away when the mirror shattered. She knew the sacrifice had been made, but what remained of her? The house, now silent, seemed to watch, waiting for Emily's next steps. Slowly ascending the stairs back to the main floor, every wall, every piece of furniture felt familiar yet strangely distant. It was as if the mansion was an old acquaintance she no longer fully recognized. Shadows still danced in the corners, but the presence that had once terrified her seemed to have dissipated, or perhaps merged with something deeper inside her. Days passed in a blur. Emily tried to return to a routine, but her mind was foggy. She read but couldn't concentrate. She attempted to cook but forgot the ingredients. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, but the person she saw there seemed strange, incomplete. The emptiness she felt grew with each passing day, and the darkness that had once inhabited the mansion now seemed to dwell within her. Nights were worse. Constant nightmares haunted her sleep, but they weren't just dreams. They were fragments of reality mixed with her broken memories. She saw the mirror reassembling, piece by piece, and the hooded figure emerging again. Only now, instead of chasing her, the entity smiled. The smile was an invitation, as if it knew that part of Emily already belonged to that other side. During one of those nights, while struggling to awaken from one of these nightmares, Emily heard something, a sound, not from the dream, but from the house. Someone was knocking at the front door. She hesitated. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, she found a man standing on the porch. It was James Turner, a local history teacher researching the genealogy of the region's oldest families. He had heard about the Harringtons and was intrigued by the reports of supernatural events surrounding the family. "Emily Harrington?" he asked cautiously. She nodded, lacking the energy to respond much. James explained that he was conducting in-depth research on the city's history and, while investigating Emily's family background, found information that she probably didn't know. He mentioned rumors of a pact made between the Harringtons and an ancient entity, something dating back centuries that was directly linked to the mirror Emily had broken. When James spoke about the mirror, Emily froze. Something inside her knew that this conversation was no coincidence. James was there for a reason, and what he carried with him could be the key to understanding what had truly happened. James entered, and together they began to sift through the old documents he had brought. Among the papers were accounts of other Harringtons who had faced the entity, each one, like Emily, paying a high price to keep the evil contained. But what frightened Emily was that, in each case, the descendants of the family eventually succumbed to the entity's power in one way or another. The past generations had faced the same battle, but no one had managed to escape the mental and spiritual consequences. As they explored more about the past, James revealed something even more disturbing. The mirror Emily had destroyed was not the only one. Throughout generations, multiple artifacts had been used to keep the entity controlled, and the destruction of one merely delayed the inevitable. The mansion was the true heart of the curse. The mirror was just a temporary portal. The shock of this revelation hit Emily like a cold wave. She believed she had sacrificed herself to stop the entity, but what she had actually done was merely postpone its return. Evil was still present, no longer within the mirror, but now, somehow, inside her. Emily's mind began to crumble. The presence she felt in her nightmares, the smile of the entity. Now everything made sense. By destroying the mirror and confronting the entity, she had connected directly with it, allowing evil to flow into her soul. From that moment on, the entity no longer needed the mansion or a mirror to manifest. It inhabited Emily. The pain of this discovery was profound. Emily felt as if she were drowning in an endless darkness. Each piece of her identity was slowly being corroded, replaced by something sinister. Even during the day, shadows seemed to follow her, and her reflection, whenever she saw it, was slightly distorted, as if another person were taking her form. James, concerned about Emily's mental deterioration, tried to convince her to leave the mansion, saying that perhaps by distancing herself from the place, she could escape the influence of the entity. But she knew it would be futile. The entity was inside her now, and fleeing wouldn't be enough. As the darkness within her grew, Emily began to remember details from the days that followed the sacrifice. Small pieces of memory, forgotten until then, resurfaced. Visions of herself wandering the house at night, in a trance, murmuring words in an ancient language she did not know. She was no longer just Emily Harrington. She was a vessel, an extension of the evil that had been awakened. The only possible solution, in Emily's mind, was to destroy herself before the entity took full control. But something stronger held her back. A part of her, still resistant, still human, fought desperately to survive. The tension in the mansion grew with each passing day, just as the darkness within Emily intensified. The presence of the entity, once a distant and threatening shadow, was now increasingly close. She could feel it in her thoughts, in the shadows stretching through the hallways, and most notably, in the distorted reflection that appeared every time she looked in the mirror. Emily knew she could not escape this battle for much longer. The entity was feeding off her mind, slowly eroding her sanity. James, the history professor trying to help her, was becoming more and more concerned. He could see the transformation in Emily. Her vacant gaze, the way her voice seemed different, darker, as if another person resided within her. They had researched everything they could about the Harrington curse, but had not found a definitive solution. The only certainty remained that the entity had been a part of the family for generations, inextricably linked to the Harrington bloodline. That night, the storm that had been threatening for days finally broke over the mansion. Lightning illuminated the dark sky, and the howling wind echoed among the trees like the screams of lost souls. Emily, sitting in her mother's old study, clutched the family diary, now filled with notes that made little sense. The words that had once been simple accounts of daily life now seemed like coded messages, whispered warnings from her ancestors. She knew the final confrontation was near. Suddenly, a sharp pain pierced her head, and she fell to her knees, clutching her skull in her hands. The voices of the entity, once a distant murmur, now screamed in her mind, words in a forgotten language that made her body tremble. When Emily lifted her eyes, the mirror in the hallway, which she had believed to be destroyed, was whole again. But this time, the reflection staring back at her was not her own. It was the hooded figure. In the reflection, the figure watched her with glowing red eyes, and behind it, a decaying version of the mansion extended, as if the mirror were a window to another dimension. She knew what this meant. The entity was ready to take complete control. Emily had few options left, but one last hope remained: to confront the entity in its own realm inside the mirror. Without a second thought, Emily approached the mirror, feeling the air around her chill as the entity grew stronger. James burst into the room, realizing that something was terribly wrong. "Emily, no!" he shouted, trying to hold her back. But she knew this was the only way. If she fled now, the entity would consume her soul completely, and no one would be safe. "I have to do this, James. There's no other way," she said, her voice trembling yet determined. And then, without hesitation, Emily touched the mirror. The moment her fingers made contact with the cold surface, she felt her body being pulled with immense force. The world around her faded away, and she was sucked into the mirror, crossing the veil between reality and the entity's domain. The sensation was like being swallowed by a dense, suffocating darkness. When she opened her eyes again, she was on the other side. The mansion surrounding her was a distorted, crumbling version of the real house. The walls were cracked, covered in mold, and the smell of rot permeated the air. The light was dim, and shadows danced in the corners, moving as if they had a life of their own. In the center of the room, the hooded entity awaited her. Emily knew this was the final moment, the climax of her struggle. There was no turning back. The entity slowly lifted its head, revealing a cadaverous face with flaming, empty eyes. The creature laughed, a raspy sound echoing off the walls. "You were always destined for this, Emily Harrington. Your blood belongs to me." But Emily was not willing to give up. She had discovered in the ancient texts that the entity's power was great, but there was a flaw in its control. The pact her ancestors had made could only be undone by someone from the family, but not through physical destruction. Rather, through the destruction of her very soul. She needed to sacrifice herself completely. With the pain still coursing through her mind, Emily gathered all the strength she had left. The entity advanced toward her, but in a final act of courage, Emily began to recite the words she found in her mother's diary, an ancient incantation that had been forgotten by the Harrington family. As she spoke, the walls of the world around her began to tremble. The entity howled, trying to stop her, but it was too late. Emily was offering the only thing the entity had yet to take, her own will. The words continued to spill from her lips, even as the entity attempted to invade her mind and crush her. The ground began to crack, and the distorted mansion around her crumbled. Emily knew this would destroy her, but it was the only way to stop the entity once and for all. Then, with one final scream, the entity lunged at her, and everything fell silent, When James finally managed to break down the office door, he found Emily lying on the floor, unconscious. The mirror, this time, was shattered, pieces strewn across the wooden floor. He rushed to her, but something was terribly wrong. Her body was cold, and her pulse weak. It seemed she had fought a battle not only with the entity but within herself, and now she was broken. Emily opened her eyes for a brief moment and looked at James. Her lips moved, and she whispered her last words. "She's gone. But so am I." And then her hand fell, and darkness engulfed her. The entity was defeated, but the cost was terrible. Emily paid the ultimate price, offering her very soul to ensure that evil would never escape again. James, kneeling beside her body, felt the weight of an irreversible tragedy. The Harrington mansion was finally silent, but its echo of pain and sacrifice would forever linger in those dark hallways. The silence that enveloped the Harrington mansion after Emily's fall was almost palpable. It was as if all the malignant energy that had haunted the place for centuries had been sucked out. James, kneeling beside Emily's lifeless body, was still in shock, unable to accept the sacrifice she had made. The entity was finally contained, but the cost was impossible to calculate. He looked around, the environment now lifeless and empty, as if the house itself were indeed dead. The mirrors, once threatening, were now just shards of glass scattered across the floor. There were no more whispers, no shadows moving. Everything seemed to have come to an end, but at a devastating price. With tears in his eyes, James got up and called the authorities, unsure of what exactly to say. When the police and ambulance arrived, they confirmed what he already knew. Emily Harrington was dead. They couldn't explain how or why. Her body showed no signs of violence, and the surroundings did not seem to have undergone any kind of physical struggle. It was as if she had simply disappeared from within. As the paramedics took Emily's body away, James lingered in the mansion for a moment longer, staring at the shattered remnants of the mirror on the floor. Her words before she died echoed in his mind. "She is gone. But I am too." He knew that evil had been defeated, but he also knew that part of Emily had been taken forever. She could not be saved because she had given everything of herself to defeat the entity. Days passed, and James tried to process everything that had happened. The Harrington mansion was sealed off by the authorities, deemed a dangerous property, and the tragic stories surrounding the family began circulating in town once more. People spoke with fear of the house, now even more convinced that something about it was cursed, something that even time could not erase. James, however, could not completely distance himself. He dedicated himself to studying more about the dark legacy of the Harringtons, trying to find comfort in the idea that Emily's sacrifice had not been in vain. But even in his studies, a persistent doubt tormented him. Had evil truly been defeated, or merely postponed? As James investigated the last documents of the family, he stumbled upon a forgotten note in the diary of Ezekiel Harrington, Emily's great-grandfather. The note spoke of the impossibility of containing evil forever, mentioning that while the mirror was one of the portals, the true receptacle of evil was the Harrington blood. James realized, horrified, that Emily's sacrifice had temporarily sealed the entity, but that the cycle could restart with another descendant of the lineage, if there was one. At that moment, he recalled something Emily had mentioned during one of their conversations. A distant cousin who had moved to another town years before. She had left the family and apparently knew nothing about the Harringtons' dark past. James felt a new wave of despair. Emily's sacrifice had been heroic, but the evil that ran in the Harrington blood could still return. The curse had not been completely broken. It was only a matter of time before it found another host. The tragedy of Emily was not just in her death, but in the fact that, despite her struggle, the evil that had haunted her family for generations still loomed like a shadow, waiting to manifest once again. Months later, the Harrington mansion remained unoccupied, isolated on top of the hill, shrouded in a mist of mystery and superstition. The townspeople avoided walking nearby, and those few who dared to tell stories about the place claimed that on the darkest nights, it was possible to see a pale figure walking through the corridors behind the windows. Some said it was Emily's spirit, trapped in the house she tried to save, while others believed it was the entity, waiting for its next opportunity. James, consumed by the weight of guilt and knowledge, withdrew from the town and the research. He knew too much, and this knowledge gnawed at him. Though the world around him had moved on, he could never forget what he had witnessed and the bitter truth he had uncovered. Emily's sacrifice had brought peace, but only temporarily. The curse of the Harringtons lingered on, like an eternal shadow, passing from generation to generation, waiting for the right moment to awaken once more.